If you scroll down to the comments of the Black Beauty trailer, you actually hear a lot of people criticizing it, saying that they didn't follow the original books, which I think came out around in like the 1800s. They were a completely different storyline. There was like a proper political message. In the current state of Disney at the moment, where they own completely everything and they're doing all the terrible remakes, it's not really that surprising that they would actually not follow the source material for just a really simple girl meets a horse type of film that is a simple pet kind of movie. I'll be talking about it in that sense. A lot of people were comparing it to this film called Flicker, which was made around 2006, and it's a similar type of like horse like pet kind of film. So I'll be talking about it in that sense. So I was watching this film around, I think it was like late November, because that's when the film came out, with my two little cousins. They always watch either Frozen or Beauty and the Beast, and this was like different considering that all the Disney remakes are all terrible. But this film I thought would be a bit different. Now keep in mind, the film actually starts off. During the middle of the film. They do the whole, it starts at like the end or the middle, and then you see how the film got to that state in the first place. That kind of thing is called like the cyclical structure. And you see the character Joe, played by Mackenzie Foy, and the horse riding on the beach. They tell you like an inspirational quote or something said by one of the characters, and they do this. Obviously, they do this at the beginning of the film. This is shown in the middle with no quote, and then they do it at the end. And I feel like that kind of gives the idea of how the film's message is really, really false. The whole film is narrated by Kate Winslet. Black Beauty herself, obviously, is like her perspective, like everything she experiences is all narrated by Kate Winslet. So when her mother dies and when she meets Joe Green, the main girl in the film. And keep in mind that when she actually speaks during the film, because obviously the whole film's in her perspective, you hear every single bit of emotion. So when she's happy or when she's sad, you're told like what she's feeling. You don't actually ever think for yourself or even like assume anything from my character. So whenever she's happy or sad, whenever she's uncertain or confused in the film, and the film is essentially the definition of show and tell rather than show don't tell. So when her mother dies at the beginning of the film, you're told that, oh, I may never see my mother ever again. It's like you're already going to assume that. And when she meets Joe Green, the main girl, she literally says something about this girl, like I really connected with because she might have lost someone like I have. And Joe Green is basically she's basically like a foil for Black Beauty. But at the same time, the main girl Jo, she kind of runs along the notion of most of the other Disney live action characters. Like if you look at the animated characters like from Disney, they're the ones that you actually care about because they're animated, they have a lot more expressions. You're gonna find a lot more interesting because there's more to get away with in 2D animation or 3D animation. When you look at a character like this, she's really, really bland, very similar to like a lot of Disney Channel main characters. So when the film is telling you everything, basically everything is from Kate Winslet's like narration. She's basically narrating every single thing that's happening from like Black Beauty's perspective. And there's a bit in the film where there's like a fire going on in a stable with a bunch of horses in it, and some are running out, some aren't, and she has to save them. And what the narration does is that it takes away a lot of the tension that you could ever get from a scene like that, because she ends up saying, I could have never made it out there, but she ends up making out anyway. Because the film I like to refer to as show and tell, it basically does the whole thing that narration could do to a film. Narration obviously is very, very useful in movies because it sort of gives in a way like just insight to the characters' sort of inner emotions, but you don't have to give like a lot out. The whole point of it is that it's used almost sparingly. It's used in a very creative way. This film, however, is the example of when narration goes bad because it tells you literally everything. You don't ever think for yourself in this film. The narration in this film almost reminded me it almost reminded me of like a little substitute if you compare it to like 2019's Lion King, where everyone kept saying about that film that because it's not animated, it's not as interesting, you're not going to get any emotion from the film because because there's no facial expression you're going to get from realistic lions and baboons and all kinds of stuff. So it felt like this was the substitute of how can you get an animal which obviously can't emote because it's not live action. How are you gonna actually put out the actual emotion? How are you gonna make them care about this horse? So it felt like that kind of like idea for it. There was also a subplot with this British family when Black Beauty was actually taken to them, and it just, I mean, they were the most interesting part about the film. We'll say they're more interesting than the main lead. The main lead was fine though. I mean, she was just kind of like, boom, sad, feel sympathy for me. I will say that character like Jessie from Toy Story 2, like, you know, she had this kind of like growing fear of being abandoned, and she was very like very jumpy and lively in that film. That film might be different because it's animated and this film's live action, but I don't know, I didn't feel like I had to truly sympathize with this character. I guess there's reason to do so, but I mean, other than that, she doesn't come across as like a super interesting character. Keep in mind the ending of Black Beauty, I think from my memory, was it Beauty is actually taken out to London. She's taken out to London under like a few other owners and ends up acting out against all her other owners, and ends up being like, I feel like Joe was never gonna come to see me ever again or anything like that. And Joe ends up coming to London, and you can correct me if I'm wrong that they're actually at some other place, and they're anywhere else. And the film is kind of just reassuring in that way. It's kind of just unchallenging because it's telling you everything, that everything's very, very easy to absorb. But it just kind of takes away from the film being actually interesting. At the end of the day, the film is just a simple, generic horse film. It's just a generic like pet film. I think it's similar to another film called like A Dog's Journey or something like that, where the dog is like given narration, and yeah, it makes the film like far less interesting. I would say that if it's the argument that kids are not going to understand the film, or they're not going to get emotionally invested unless you tell them to and you're going to actually explain every single bit, then, well, first of all, there's already plenty of movies, there's plenty of Disney films that you can go to where there's plenty animated films or the 2D animated films that are already enough for them to care about without having to explain everything. And if it's the case of just adding a narration because you feel like they're not going to understand it, then it's just simple as you're not respecting your audience. You're not respecting your audience to actually to think that they'll actually get emotionally invested unless you tell them to. I would say that the main lead, Jo, she wasn't as bad as something like Mulan, the Mulan live action film, where she was completely just boring, so emotionless, and like pretty much it was super positive in that film, where she didn't go through any, I mean, of course she went through proper change, but other than that, she literally had no emotion or anything like that. She was super stoic. The main lead, Jo, she's not as bad as that, but still, obviously the film is nothing, it's nothing really to get crazy about. Black Beauty it's not offensively bad, but it's just not special at all. It's not something that you'd get if you wanted like a Disney Plus account. But that's kind of why I say that it's a very show and tell film. It literally shows you everything. Obviously, it's not exactly that amazingly shot or anything like that. It's quite generic and quite uninspired. But it's also tell, because it's all narrated with horse perspective. It kind of reminded me of, because Kate Winslet does the narration for Black Beauty, it reminded me of that episode in Extras where she says that you get an Oscar if you do any of these like really amazing things or do these really daring things. And it would be funny to think that like this was an example where like they believe that kids aren't going to understand the films and I'm gonna understand like movies with like darker, deeper messages, and this film is gonna try to like help them to do that, because the producers may think that the audience can't actually invest themselves into the characters.